Today, Philosophy Insights did some special editing of Jordan Peterson's lecture, and I hope you enjoy the content.
There's the Father that you have, and that's a human being, that's a man like other men, a man among men, but then there's the Father as such, and that's the Spirit of the Father. And insofar as you have a Father, you have both at the same time. You have the personal Father that's a man among other men, just like anyone else's father. But insofar as that man is your father, that means that he's something different than just another person. And what he is the incarnation of the Spirit of the Father. And to see that, to take it to what? To disrespect that carelessly. Maybe even, like Noah makes a mistake, right? He produces wine and gets himself drunk. And you might say, well, you know, if he's sprawled out there for everyone to see, it's hardly Ham's fault if he stumbles across him. But the book is laying out a danger. And the danger is that, well, maybe you catch your father at his most vulnerable moment, and if you're disrespectful, then you transgress against the Spirit of the Father. And if you transgress against the Spirit of the Father and lose respect for the Spirit of the Father, then that is likely to transform you into a slave. That's a very interesting idea, and I think it's particularly interesting, maybe not particularly interesting, but it's particularly germane, I think, to our current cultural situation, because I think that we're pushed constantly to see the nakedness of our Father, so to speak, because of the intense criticism that's directed towards our culture and the patriarchal culture, so to speak. We're constantly exposing its weaknesses and vulnerabilities and, let's say, nakedness. And there's nothing wrong with criticism, but the thing about criticism is the purpose of criticism is to separate the wheat from the chaff. It's not to burn everything to the ground, right? It's to say, well, we're going to carefully look at this. We're going to carefully differentiate. We're going to keep what's good, and we're going to move away from what's bad. But the point of the criticism isn't to identify everything as bad. It's to separate what's good from what's bad so that you can retain what's good and move towards it. And to be careless at that is deadly, because you're inhabited by the Spirit of the Father, right? Insofar as you're a cultural construction, which of course is something that the postmodern neo-marxists are absolutely emphatic about. You're a cultural construction. Insofar as you're a cultural construction, then you're inhabited by the Spirit of the Father. And to be disrespectful towards that means to undermine the very structure that makes you not all of what you are, certainly not all of what you are, but a good portion of what you are, insofar as you're a socialized cultural entity. And if you pull the foundation out from underneath that, what do you have left? You can hardly manage on your own. You know, it's just not possible. You're a cultural creation. And so Ham makes this desperate error and is careless about exposing himself to the vulnerability of his father, something like that. He does it without sufficient respect. And the judgment is that not only will he be a slave, but so will all of his descendants. And he's contrasted with the other two sons who, I suppose, are willing to give their father the benefit of the doubt, something like that. And so when they see him in a compromising position, they handle it with respect and don't capitalize on it. And maybe that makes them strong. That's what it seems to me. And so I think that's what that story means. It has something to do with respect. You know, and the funny thing about having respect for your culture, and I suppose that's partly why I'm doing the biblical stories, is because they're part of my culture. They're part of our culture, perhaps, but they're certainly part of my culture. And it seems to me that it's worthwhile to treat that with respect, to see what you can glean from it, and not kick it when it's down, let's say. So that's how the story of Noah ends. You know, and the thing too is Noah is actually a pretty decent incarnation of the Spirit of the Father, which I suppose is one of the things that makes Ham's misstep more egregious, is that I mean, Noah just built an ark and got everybody through the flood, man, you know? It's not so bad. And so maybe the fact that he happened to drink too much wine one day wasn't enough to justify humiliating him. And you know, I don't think it's pushing the limits of symbolic interpretation to note on a daily basis that we're all contained in an ark, right? And that's the ark that, you could think about that as the ark that's been bequeathed to us by our forefathers. That's the tremendous infrastructure that we inhabit, that we take for granted, because it works so well, that protects us from things that we can't even imagine, and we don't have to imagine because we're so well protected. And so one of the things that's really struck me hard, I would say, about the disintegration and corruption of the universities is the absolute ingratitude that goes along with that. You know, criticism, as I said, is a fine thing if it's done in the spirit, in a proper spirit. And that's the spirit of separating the wheat from the chaff. But it needs to be accompanied by gratitude. And it does seem to me that anyone who lives in the West, in the Western culture at this time in history and in this place, and who isn't simultaneously grateful for that is half blind, at least, because it's never been better than this. And it could be so much worse. And it's highly likely that it will be so much worse, because for most of human history, so much worse is the norm. So, then there's this little story that crops up that seems in some ways unrelated to everything that's gone before it. But I think it's also an extremely profound little story. It took me a long time to figure it out. It's the Tower of Babel. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and dwelt there. That's Noah's descendants. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, "Go, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. So they're establishing a city. And they said, "Go, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men built. And the Lord said, "Behold, the people is one, and they all have one language, and now this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. It's a very difficult story to understand. On the face of it, it doesn't seem to show God in a very good light, although that happens fairly frequently in the Old Testament, as far as I can tell. But, you know, the thing to do, if you're reading in the spirit of the text, let's say, is to remember that it's God that you're talking about. And so, even though you might think that he's appearing in a bad light, your duty as a reader, I suppose, is to assume that you're wrong and that what he did was right. And then you're supposed to figure out, well, how could it possibly be right? Because the axiomatic presupposition is that it's God and whatever he does is right. And you might say, well, you can disagree with that. And it's also the case that some of the people that God talks to in the Old Testament actually disagree with him and convince him to alter his actions. But the point still remains that it's God, and if he's doing it, then by definition, there's a good reason. There's an idea much later that John Milton develops in Paradise Lost, which is an amazing poem. And it's a profound enough poem so that it's almost been incorporated into the biblical structure, I would say. So the corpus of Christianity post-Milton was saturated by the Miltonic stories of Satan's rebellion. None of that's in the biblical texts, or it's only hinted at in very brief passages. And Milton wrote his poem, to justify the ways of God to man, which is quite an ambition. Really, it's an amazing, profound ambition to try to produce something, to produce a literary work that justifies being to human beings, because that's what Milton was trying to do. So one of my readers here sent me a link the other day, or viewers, to a work of philosophy by an Australian philosopher whose name I don't remember, who basically wrote a book saying that being as such, human experience, is so corrupt and so permeated by suffering that it would be better if it had never existed at all. It's sort of the ultimate expression of nihilism. And Goethe in Faust, his Mephistopheles, who's a satanic character, obviously, has that as a credo. That's Satan's fundamental motivation, is his objection to creation itself is that creation is so flawed and so rife with suffering that it would be better if it had never existed at all. And so that's his motivation for attempting to continue to destroy it. In Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan is an intellectual figure. And you see that motif emerge very frequently, by the way, in popular culture. So, for example, in The Lion King, the figure of Scar, who's a satanic figure, is also hyper-intellectual. And that's very common, that, you know, it's the evil scientist motif, or the evil advisor to the king, the same motif. It encapsulates something about rationality, and what it seems to encapsulate is the idea that rationality, like Satan, is the highest angel in God's heavenly kingdom. It's a psychological idea, you know, that the most powerful sub-element of the human psyche is the intellect. And it's the thing that shines out above all, within the domain of humanity and maybe across the domain of life itself. The human intellect, there's something absolutely remarkable about it, but it has a flaw, and the flaw is that it tends to fall in love with its own productions and to assume that they're total. Solzhenitsyn, when he was writing the Gulag Archipelago, had a warning about that with regards to totalitarian ideology. And he said that the price of selling your God-given soul to the entrapments of human dogma was slavery and death, essentially. And Satan, in Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan decides that he can do without the transcendent, he can do without God, and that's why he foments rebellion. It's something like that. And the consequence of that, the immediate consequence from Milton's perspective, was that as soon as Satan decided that what he knew was sufficient and that he could do without the transcendent, which you might think about as the domain outside of what you know, something like that, immediately he was in hell.